I'm going to read a short chapter, Friendship with Freud, from a book on Carl Jung by Anthony Stevens, Carl Jung, A Brief Insight. Realizing that his experimental findings provided objective support for Freud's theory of repression, Jung sent him a copy of his book, Studies in Word Association, on its publication in 1906. Freud's enthusiastic response encouraged Jung to go to Vienna to meet him in March 1907. They got on so well that they talked without interruption for 13 hours. There's no doubt that they were intellectually infatuated with one another, and the friendship which blossomed between them, largely sustained by correspondence, lasted for nearly 6 years. Like Bleuler, Freud was impressed by Jung's energy, enthusiasm, and commitment. He became powerfully attached to him, recognizing him as the ablest helper to have joined me thus far, and seeing him as his probable successor as leader of the psychoanalytic movement. Although Freud was only 50 when they met, he was something of a hypochondriac and had a superstitious fear that he had only 12 years longer to live. Securing the succession was thus a high priority for him, and on the face of it, Jung was an excellent choice for the role. He had a first-rate mind, was a successful psychiatrist working at one of Europe's most respected hospitals, and, perhaps most important of all, he was not Viennese and he was not a Jew. Freud was acutely aware of the danger that anti-Semitism, associated with public disgust at his ideas on infantile sexuality, could result in the widespread rejection or even suppression of psychoanalysis, and he hoped that the adherence of a Swiss Christian of Jung's stature could help rescue his movement from this fate. In addition, Jung was able to make significant contributions to psychoanalytic theory and practice. Not only did his word association experiments provide hard empirical evidence for the existence and power of unconscious complexes, but his work with schizophrenics carried psychoanalytic concepts into areas beyond Freud's reach. Freud trained as a neurologist and had little psychiatric experience, having worked only briefly as a locum tenens in a mental hospital. Moreover, Jung infected Freud with his enthusiasm for the study of mythology and comparative religion, though with potentially disastrous consequences, for the conclusions that both men drew from these studies were explosively at variance with one another. On Jung's side, the desire for Freud's friendship was as much personal as professional. In the older, more experienced man, he found a mentor, a distinguished colleague who represented the intellectually courageous father that his own father, the doubting theologian, was not. Both men understood this. "Let me enjoy your friendship not as one between equals, but as that of a father and son," wrote Jung soon after their first meeting. Freud responded at a later date by formally anointing Jung as his son and heir, his crown prince. In fact, Freud needed a son no less than Jung needed a father. But the kind of son Freud wanted was one who would be willing to defer unconditionally to his authority and to perpetuate without modification the doctrines and principles of his rule. For his part, Jung needed a father figure through whose influence he could overcome his adolescent misgivings and discover his own masculine authority. Although Jung basked in Freud's approval and was flattered to be deemed a worthy successor to him, he knew that he could not endorse Freud's ideas in their entirety. Nor could he sacrifice his intellectual integrity to a set of dogmas in the way that his father had done. He nevertheless acquiesced in Freud's wish that he should serve as the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association when it was set up in 1910, and as chief editor of the first psychoanalytic journal, the Jahrbuch. As time passed, Jung's differences with Freud became harder to conceal. Two of Freud's basic assumptions were unacceptable to him. One, that human motivation is exclusively sexual, and two, that the unconscious mind is entirely personal and peculiar to the individual. Jung found these and other aspects of Freud's thinking reductionist and too narrow. Instead of conceiving psychic energy, or libido as Freud called it, as wholly sexual, Jung preferred to think of it as a more generalized life force, of which sexuality was but one mode of expression. Moreover, beneath the personal unconscious of repressed wishes and traumatic memories posited by Freud, Jung believed there lay a deeper and more important layer that he was to call the collective unconscious, which contained in potentia the entire psychic heritage of mankind. The existence of this ancient basis of the mind had first been hinted to him as a child when he realized that there were things in his dreams that came from somewhere beyond himself. Its existence was confirmed when he studied the delusions and hallucinations of schizophrenic patients and found them to contain symbols and images which also occurred in myths and fairy tales all over the world. He concluded that there must exist a dynamic psychic substratum common to all humanity on the basis of which each individual builds his or her private experience of life. Whenever he attempted to express these ideas to Freud, however, they were attributed either to youthful inexperience or to resistance. Don't deviate too far from me when you are really so close to me, for if you do, we may one day be played off against one another, Freud admonished him, adding, "My inclination is to treat those colleagues who offer resistance exactly as we would treat patients in the same situation." Jung was irked by such condescension, and it was inevitable, given the character of the two men, that a row would eventually break out between them. It was heralded in 1911 by the publication of the first part of Jung's Transformations and Symbols of the Libido. "It is a risky business for an egg to be cleverer than the hen," Jung wrote to Freud. "Still, what is in the egg must find the courage to creep out." And finally erupted in 1912 with publication of Part 2. In a letter to Freud, Jung quoted Zarathustra: "One repays a teacher badly if one remains only a pupil." In this work and in a series of lectures given in New York in September 1912, Jung spelled out the heretical view that libido was a much wider concept than Freud allowed, and that it could appear in crystallized form in the universal symbols or primordial images apparent in the myths of humanity. Jung drew special attention to the myth of the hero, interpreting the recurrent theme of his fight with a dragon monster as the struggle of the adolescent ego for deliverance from the mother. This led him to interpretations of the Oedipus complex and the incest taboo, which were very different from those proposed by Freud. In Jung's view, a child became attached to his mother not because she was the object of incestuous passion, as Freud maintained, but because she was the provider of love and care. A view which anticipated in the theoretical revolution wrought some 40 years later by the British analyst and psychiatrist John Bowlby. Furthermore, Jung maintained that the incest taboo was primary. It existed a priori and was not derived from the father's prohibition of the boy's lust for his mother, as Freud insisted. Oedipal longings, when they occurred, were the consequence of incest prohibition rather than its cause. Jung also argued that the Oedipus complex was not the universal phenomenon that Freud declared it to be. In redefining libido as undifferentiated psychic energy, Jung looked beyond psychology to parallels in physics, in particular to the theory of the transformation of energy, as proposed by Robert Mayer. All psychological phenomena, like all physical phenomena, Jung argued, are manifestations of energy, and this gives symbols their dynamic transformative power. Publication of these views provoked a major rift with Freud, which resulted in the formal termination of their relationship early in 1913. Jung resigned his presidency of the association, his editorship of the Jahrbuch, and his lectureship at the University of Zurich, and withdrew from the psychoanalytic movement. Once again, he was entirely on his own. The manner in which their friendship ended was typical of them both. To Jung, the purpose of life was to realize one's own potential, to follow one's own perception of the truth, and to become a whole person in one's own right. This was the goal of individuation, as he later called it. If he was to keep faith with himself, he had to go his own way. It would have been impossible for him to spend his life playing second fiddle in a two-man band. As for Freud, belief in the correctness of his own theories was absolute, and this made him so intolerant of dissent that he usually ended up provoking it. He was a strange amalgam of autocrat and masochist. As he once admitted to Jung, his emotional life demanded the existence of an intimate friend and a hated enemy, and not infrequently he encountered both in the same person. This pattern was apparent in his childhood relationship with his nephew John, who happened to be his own age, and in the friendship which supported him through his period of splendid isolation, 1894 to 99, when he was conducting his self-analysis and establishing the principles of psychoanalysis with Wilhelm Fleiss. Freud's friendship with Jung, the quarrel, and Jung's subsequent loss to psychoanalysis constituted but one of a number of such painful episodes. A similar fate overtook Freud's relationship with Breuer, Adler, Steichel, Maynard, Silberer, Tosk, and Wilhelm Reich. Reich developed a psychosis from which he recovered only temporarily, while Silberer and Tusk eventually committed suicide. For Jung, the consequences were almost as dire, for he fell into a protracted state of disorientation, at times verging on psychosis, which lasted 4 or 5 years. Although profoundly disturbing, this proved to be a period of intense creativity, which Jung referred to as his confrontation with the unconscious, and it was triggered as much by upheavals in his domestic life as by the loss of his friendship with Freud.